Now, I'm still going on about this fascinating conversation I had yesterday with Dr. Monty Suter about his latest book, looking at New Zealand in early colonial times, the impact that muskets and missionaries in particular had on Māori people. A fascinating book. Do recommend that you get a copy, out in bookstores this week. But continuing on that theme, I suppose, looking at New Zealand and its history 200 years ago this month. Joining me on the program now, Reverend Dr Malcolm Faloon. Malcolm, kia ora, good morning.
Yeah, kia ora, Andrew.
It is a fascinating period of history, and one thing I did love about the book that I read, it, as much as only a book can, a good book at least, is that it takes you back to that period of time. You feel like you're living in that period of history. Now, you've dived pretty deeply into that well yourself in terms of your research and your study in terms of what New Zealand was like at that time. But today, looking at a significant figure in the New Zealand story, significant particularly in his contribution to our understanding of Te Reo Māori.
Yes, he may be a lesser known figure, but just as important and influential in the beginning of Christianity here among Māori people in New Zealand. His name's Tuai. The sailors knew him as Tommy Tuai, and he came from Paroa Bay, which was the southern entrance to the Bay of Islands. Ruatara was on the northern entrance under Te Pahi, and Tuai was his elder brother Korokoro controlled the southern entrance of the Bay of Islands, and so he was. But Tuai was. This week marks 200 years of his death. He died on 17th of October, 1824. Aged probably around 27.
Wow.
But in some ways, his death was, there's a sadness to his death because he had an emerging Christian faith which wasn't able to come to fruition, as hopefully I'll be able to explain to you.
He, as you say, he's not necessarily well known in the history books. He doesn't get a chapter. There's no, as far as we know, are there any images of what he looked like?
Yes, there are. There are, and we could show you that because he was an early visitor, like Ruatara. I mean, people might know the name Ruatara because Ruatara is the one who hosted the first mission in Rangiahoa, and started Christmas Day 1814. But at that occasion, Tuai and his brother Korokoro were there, and in fact, he was one of the 5 chiefs who went with Ruatara to invite Samuel Marsden, the missionaries to New Zealand. He had been an earlier visitor to Parramatta, and so he was known to Samuel Marsden. And when his brother Korokoro died, he succeeded the tribe, and he was very keen that a missionary be placed with him. In Paroa Bay, it never came about.
Okay.
He even travelled to England, and I think this is where his most significance lay, actually, in his trip to England. He was one of the very early visitors to England. Ruatara had been there for a few weeks, never really got off the boat. But Tuai was spent almost a year in 1818 in England, and it's there where his significance lies.
This is, I suppose, a time of fascination of English culture with what's happening in different parts of the world. And like I mentioned in the introduction, that Tuai was significant in starting the process that led to an understanding and assembling of a vocabulary and a dictionary for the Māori language. Now, he didn't complete that process, but he certainly did a lot of the groundwork for it.
Exactly, and this wasn't accidental that he's going in these ways. Like Maui, who visited England the year, he's fascinated by the pottery and the china that is being made. But he worked with a man called Samuel Lee. Now, Samuel Lee was a natural linguist associated with the CMS, who went on to become a professor of linguistics at Cambridge University. He really, in many ways, founded the whole study of linguistics. And it's working with Tuai that Samuel Lee was able to build on what Thomas Kendall had done in the very beginning of the mission, to fix the spelling and the grammar and the alphabet and those kind of things. Later, a couple of years later, Kendall was able to come to England with Honi Hika and Waikato, and there was more work done on the language. But Tuai was quite important in that regard. But there's another significance to his trip as well, not simply about fixing the language of Maori, but he inspired that second wave of missionaries to come to New Zealand. So even though in 1814 the mission had established at Rangiahoa, it had been quite a struggle. But in 1819, Tuai returns to New Zealand, and he comes back with a whole new group of missionaries who he had met in England. John Butler, James Kemp, Francis Hall, and this is where, with these missionaries, surely I can have one of these missionaries. But Samuel Mars was very keen, under Honi Hika's leadership, to establish a mission station at Kerikeri as the second station. The difficulty is that Korokoro came from a different part of the Ngāpuhi Confederation, and actually was in competition with Honi Hika, and so they were concerned that without a missionary, that they would actually be pushed out. When Korokoro died, Tuai took over. When Marsden returned with Henry Williams in 1823 to establish a mission station, why don't you come to us? Why don't you come to us? Now the thing is, I would like to read Tuai's farewell letter to the CMS in England. It's just a very short couple of paragraphs if we've got time.
Yes, certainly.
He wrote to Edward Beckersheth, who had been visiting him just before departing. And this is his final letter to Edward Beckersheth, who was the Assistant Secretary of the CMS. My dear brother, and written down by Francis Hall. So we don't know to what extent Francis Hall was influenced in the language, but this is how it goes. My dear brother, Reverend Mr. Beckersheth, you know how poorly I was time I see you. You come down from London to Brompton to see me. I feel sorry and cry. I want to see you once more, if please the Lord, suppose you get any time. I very ill in bed. So many friends pray for me. Jesus looked on me and made me better. I very weak yet, and my voice quite weak. I cannot speak very well. It make me cough. I no afraid to die. Jesus died for my sins. I feel quite happy. I hope my heart be quite good the time I get home to New Zealand. I tell my countrymen, come into the house and worship God. Suppose you know worship God, you know happy. Jesus Christ, he died on the cross for New Zealand man's sin and Englishman's sin. Suppose you believe him, he save you and make you happy, as he has made Thomas Tuai happy by his Holy Spirit.
Wow.
That's his parting letter.
That is remarkable.
And this is the tragedy of the fact that when it came to fix, I can understand why Marsden would fix on Kerikeri, but Paihia, what a heartbreak. Tommy Tuai was in charge of his tribe now. He had a heart to see the gospel flourish in New Zealand. But the reason they didn't want to put it at Paeroa was because of the war parties that are coming in and out of the bay, and they'd all go past Paeroa Bay, and they knew the trouble that had happened at Rangiahoa, and so they're very reluctant to put it there. But it meant that when Tuai died in this 200 years ago this week, he died of tuberculosis, but his tribe was scattered by the Honi Hika and his the other Ngāpuhi leaders. They had taken control of that area, and all his people were dispersed amongst the other tribes. And in some ways, it's a kind of the CMS described him on his death. They wrote an obituary for him. They said, we can't be fully confident, but what might have been if he had a missionary to allow his faith to take root. Now, my view is that he was a convert.
Oh, yes. I think it's clear in the letter, regardless of whether or not he was baptised or took on English airs and graces, perhaps.
he was wanting to turn his back on warfare.
Yeah.
He needed a missionary in order to do that. You see, you can't just can't extract yourself from your cultural and leadership obligations that you have for your people. You need a circuit breaker, and to have the missionary was that way of breaking that cycle, and as eventually happened in 1830. So,
I mean, if only it were different, and the missionaries made the decision to go with Hongi Hika, who, of course, was a leader of the musket wars, caused so much death and devastation, instead of going with Tuai, who was a man of peace.
I'd love to talk about Hongi Hika as well, because I think he was a man of actually also a man of deep integrity and an emerging Christian faith. Not quite as overt as Tommy Tuai, but he Samuel Marsden strived with Hongi Hika, and really Hongi Hika realised that he can't betray his people by advocating leadership.
Yeah.
He needed to, and I think this is the thing, that when embracing Christianity, it needed to be done as Maori chiefs, as Maori leaders, not simply extracting them out as if somehow you could remove people's cultural and political leadership.
No, hey, such an important topic, and I look forward to talking more about Hongi Hika perhaps on another occasion. Malcolm, thanks for bringing this fascinating story, and the story in particular of Tuai and what might have been perhaps for early colonial history. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks very much for joining us in the Rhema studio. Thanks very much for watching the interview. It's kind of nice to have an audience, actually. And if you did like what you watched, then do give us a like, do give us the thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more interviews like that one, or perhaps even better, subscribe and those interviews will come straight to you. Don't forget to turn on your notifications, and we'll see you in the next one. Cheers.